Welcome to G Fun Facts Online, where we dive deep into the hidden mechanics of our world. Today, we are not just talking about history, we are talking about the single most successful survival guide humanity has ever written. We are exploring the Montreal Protocol. You might think of it as a boring trade treaty from the 1980s about refrigerators and hairspray, but that is a massive understatement. The Montreal Protocol is actually a high-stakes thriller. It involves a planetary shield, a looming apocalypse, corporate espionage, Cold War diplomacy, and a literal hole in the sky. If this treaty had failed, you would not be listening to this right now. We would be living in a world described by scientists as the scorched earth scenario, where agriculture has collapsed and going outside for 10 minutes guarantees a sunburn. So let's skip the long intro and dissect exactly how we stepped back from the brink and why this specific treaty is the only blueprint we have for solving the current climate crisis. Our story begins in the laboratories of the 1970s. At that time, chlorofluorocarbons, or CFCs, were the superstars of the chemical world. They were marketed under names like Freon. They were non-toxic, non-flammable, and chemically stable. They were the industrial blood of the post-war boom, cooling our fridges, propelling our deodorants, and creating the foam in our car seats. They were everywhere because they seemed perfect. But in 1974, two chemists at the University of California, Irvine, named Mario Molina and F. Sherwood Rowland, asked a question that nobody else was asking. They asked, where do all these billions of pounds of CFCs go? Because they are so stable, they do not break down in the lower atmosphere. Molina and Rowland did the math and realized these molecules drift up into the stratosphere. There, they are bombarded by harsh, ultraviolet radiation, which shatters them and releases chlorine atoms. This was the terrifying discovery. They found that a single chlorine atom acts like a serial killer in the sky. It catalyzes the destruction of ozone molecules without being consumed itself. One chlorine atom can destroy up to 100,000 ozone molecules. This meant our hairspray was actively eating the shield that protects all life on Earth from deadly UVB radiation. When they published this in the journal Nature, the industry backlash was ferocious. The chemical giant DuPont called it science fiction. Aerosol manufacturers launched a PR war. For a decade, it was just a theoretical debate. The industry said the science wasn't settled. Then, Nature stopped being polite. In May 1985, scientists from the British Antarctic Survey dropped a bombshell. They had been measuring ozone levels above Antarctica and found massive, seasonal losses. It was a hole in the sky. The data was so bad they initially thought their instruments were broken. They checked, rechecked, and confirmed it. Ironically, NASA had satellites looking at the same spot, but their computers were programmed to ignore data that looked like an error, so they missed the hole entirely until the British team pointed it out. Suddenly, the threat wasn't a theory. It was a bruise the size of North America on the planet's face. This leads us to the diplomatic miracle that followed. The political reaction to the ozone hole is a masterclass in crisis management. But it almost went off the rails. In the US, the Reagan administration was divided. You had the Department of the Interior Secretary, Donald Hodel, who infamously suggested that instead of regulating a billion-dollar industry, people should just wear hats and sunglasses. The press mocked this as the Ray-Ban plan. But the State Department saw a different angle. They realized that US companies like DuPont were actually ahead of the Europeans in developing substitutes. A global ban could actually give American industry a competitive edge. President Reagan, a skin cancer survivor himself, eventually sided with the regulators, but the negotiations in Montreal in 1987 were brutal. The European community was dragging its feet. Developing nations like India and China asked a very fair question. They argued that the West had built its wealth using CFCs, so why should developing nations be denied the same path to industrialization? This is where the Montreal Protocol displayed its genius. It didn't just set a rule. It built a machine to solve the problem. They designed the treaty with 4 brilliant mechanisms that we still study today. First was the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. They gave developing countries a 10-year grace period to comply. Second was the stick, which came in the form of trade measures. The protocol banned trade in ozone-depleting substances with non-parties. This was huge. If a country didn't sign the treaty, they lost access to the global market for refrigerants and electronics. It forced everyone to the table. Third was the carrot, known as the Multilateral Fund. Established in 1990, this fund transferred over $4 billion from rich countries to poor ones to pay for the transition to safer chemicals. It paid for factory conversions in China and retrofitted fishing fleets in the Maldives. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, was the Start and Strengthen model. The initial treaty only called for a 50% cut. It wasn't perfect, but it got everyone signed up. Then, they established the Technology and Economic Assessment Panel, or TEAP. These were experts who would report back when new technology became available. As soon as a substitute for a chemical was found, the treaty automatically ratcheted up the restrictions. This created a virtuous cycle. Companies poured money into R&D because they knew the regulations were coming. The impossible became standard practice within years. The results speak for themselves. The Montreal Protocol is the only UN treaty to achieve universal ratification. Every country on Earth signed it. It has phased out 98% of ozone-depleting substances. But here is the twist that most people miss. The Montreal Protocol is also the most successful climate treaty in history, completely by accident. It turns out that CFCs are super greenhouse gases. One molecule of CFC12 traps as much heat as 11,000 molecules of carbon dioxide. By eliminating them, the protocol has delayed global warming by an estimated 2.5 degrees Celsius. It did more for the climate than the Kyoto Protocol ever did. However, every solution creates a new problem. To replace CFCs, the industry switched to hydrofluorocarbons, or HFCs. These are great for the ozone, but they are terrible for the climate. They are also potent greenhouse gases. As air conditioning demand exploded in India and China, HFC emissions skyrocketed. We were essentially saving the ozone layer but cooking the planet. Recognizing this, the diplomats went back to work. In 2016, they signed the Kigali Amendment, which brought HFCs under the control of the Montreal Protocol. This amendment mandates a phase-down of HFCs by over 80%. If fully implemented, this single piece of paper will avoid up to 0.5 degrees of warming by the end of the century. That is a massive victory. But let's not pretend everything is perfect. The protocol is currently facing stress tests. In 2018, scientists noticed that emissions of a banned chemical, CFC11, were rising mysteriously. The decline had slowed by 50%. An undercover investigation by the Environmental Investigation Agency traced the gas to the polyurethane foam industry in China. Factory owners were using the illegal chemical because it was cheaper and worked better. This was a crisis of compliance. But the system worked. China was presented with the data, launched a massive crackdown, and emissions dropped back to expected levels. It proved that the atmospheric monitoring system is the ultimate watchdog. Looking forward, the next big challenge is what experts call the banks. We have stopped producing these chemicals, but millions of tons are still sitting in old fridges, building insulation, and air conditioners. These are chemical time bombs. Collectively, they hold about 15 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent. That is more than the annual emissions of China. The protocol does not currently mandate their destruction, and recovering them is expensive. This is the next frontier. We also have the issue of nitrous oxide, or N2O. It is now the dominant ozone-depleting substance left, but it comes from fertilizer and agriculture, making it a political minefield that the protocol hasn't touched yet. So what is the takeaway? Why does this matter today? The Montreal Protocol proves that we are not helpless. We often feel paralyzed by the scale of climate change, but we have already solved a planetary crisis once. We did it by aligning science, industry, and diplomacy. We used trade bans as sticks and funding as carrots. We acted before the science was 100% settled, using the precautionary principle. Because of those decisions, the ozone hole is healing. It is expected to recover to 1980 levels by 2066. We are living in the timeline where we dodged the bullet. The sky is literally healing above us because we decided, as a species, to fix it. That is the lesson we need to take into the fight against carbon dioxide. Thank you for listening to G Fun Facts Online. If you want to dive deeper, check the references in the description.